Hey, how's it going? We all love knights, do we not? Well, how about some forks?
Thanks, Chloe. And yes, in this lesson we'll be learning about knight forks. First, a quick reminder. Knights do not like the edge of the board or the corners. They like the center of the board. And the reason is very easy to explain. When the knight is in the middle of the board, it controls many squares, as many as 8 different squares. In fact, you could say that a knight is a little bit like an octopus with many tentacles. So the more room it has, the better, because you can attack more targets with it. Here's another example. Those two knights are beautifully posted. They attack 8 different targets. But watch what happens as we move those knights towards the edge of the board. The one on b5 only controls 6 squares, the one on b6, 6 squares, and the one on g7 only controls 4 squares. The reason? They're closer to the edge of the board and the corners. And this is even more dramatic. The knight on g8 can only control 3 squares. The one on h4 only controls 4, and the one on h1 can only jump to 2 different squares. Now let's see our first knight fork. The knight goes to f7, delivering a check, but at the same time the knight is attacking the rook. So when the king moves somewhere, we simply take the rook. Pretty simple. In the final position, white will win easily because the pawn will eventually promote and become a queen. And this is very similar also. The difference is now the king can take the knight after the knight fork. However, in the resulting position, white will win because he grabs the opposition, something that we'll learn later. There's no way black can stop the pawn now. Alright, this is a little bit more sophisticated. As you can see, this bishop is attacking the pawn on f7, but that pawn is well defended by the black king. But watch what happens now when we move the knight to g5. Suddenly we have 2 pieces attacking f7, and if black does nothing about it, like if he goes h6 here, then we take on f7, attacking the queen and the rook. That's a knight fork, alright. The bishop is protecting the knight, and that means the king cannot take the knight. Alright, now in this position we need to calculate the consequences of our moves. We need to foresee what's going to happen in the position before it actually happens, before we actually make the move. We do have this move, it's a pawn check. And the problem for black is, if he moves his king to f8, then the pawn will promote and become a queen, and then white will be winning. But if the king goes to h8 instead, then white simply goes knight f7, and then the queen is lost because of the knight fork. King takes pawn, and then knight takes, and white will promote that pawn. Easy win. Now, sometimes we need to give something up in order to get something more valuable. I guess you could say we need to invest. And here, white can actually give up his rook, forcing the king to move to h8, and then we deliver a knight fork. My point in showing you this position is that quite often in a chess game, you won't be able to do a knight fork unless you make a special move first, like rook h8 here. Because you'll be playing against people who can see what your next move is going to be. So you will have to make a sacrifice like this perhaps, or other sacrifices. Here's a very simple position. Knight f7, knight fork, the king has to move, and then we take the queen. Pretty obvious. But watch this. This time there's no knight fork available. In fact, if we try knight c6, it doesn't quite work because black has a pawn on b7 and the pawn can take our knight. However, we do have a very nice move. We can play bishop to g5, pinning the queen and the king, and that means the queen is now forced to take it, and then the knight fork works fine. This is another example of what I meant earlier on. Quite often, you'll need to make a sacrifice in order to deliver a knight fork. Here's another position. There is a pawn on b7 controlling the c6 square, but we've got two knights, so we can afford to give one up. And then we have the knight fork. And the final position, white's got this extra pawn and it's going to be an easy win. And here we need to calculate once again. It's a little bit more elaborate. First we deliver a check, and now the king has to move to d8. And now that king is on the same file as our rook. So that means we can actually put our knight on c6, because the knight on d7 is pinned. See, it's illegal. He can't take our knight because then the king would be in check. So that's a beautiful knight fork. The king has to move, and then we take that. He takes back, and we're a rook up. Rook and bishop versus bishop. White's winning easily. Pretty obvious position. White takes on d7 and knight fork. But here, once again, we need to make a sacrifice. We sacrifice our rook, force the king to go to f8, and then knight takes d7, the knight fork works again. Another obvious position, and we pick up the queen, knight fork. And here we need to sacrifice something. We can get the queen first. Of course, the king is going to take back, but then we've got the position that we want. The knight can go to g6. The king moves, we take the queen, and then it's going to be an easy win. Quite often, the quickest road to a knight fork is an exchange of pieces. And this is a good example from a real game between two very strong players. White takes on c8, he takes back, we take that, he takes back, and then, at the end of all these, knight here with a knight fork. So remember, exchanges often do work if they end up with a knight fork. Alright, in this position, white would love to go knight d6 check and deliver a knight fork. Unfortunately, that square is guarded by the rook. So what do? We get rid of that rook. Yes, we do sacrifice the queen, but now the rook is gone, and then we can go knight d6. When the king moves, we take the queen, he takes back, and we've got two rooks versus rook and bishop. So white should be winning. Here's another one. Black can now play knight to d3, check. It's a knight fork. It's true that the d3 square is guarded by the rook, but that rook is overloaded because that rook has to defend the d3 square and he has to defend the queen as well. So when the rook takes it, that means the queen is no longer protected and we can simply pick it up. This is an even more complicated example, but very nice. First, we get rid of this knight because it controls that square. We want to put our knight there, but there are two pieces controlling the e3 square. So first we get rid of one of them. Check. He has to take back. Then we sacrifice our queen. And when the knight takes back, There's no longer a rook controlling this square, and there's no longer a knight on d1 controlling the e3 square. And then we go knight check, king here, and we pick up the queen. True, material is about even, but there's a big difference because black's got 2 extra pawns, 4 versus 2 on the king side. So white should be winning easily. So this just about wraps up our lesson. We've learned that, knight forks are not always as simple as they seem. Sometimes we do need to make investments, we need to make sacrifices, give something up in order to make a good knight fork. That's the end of our lesson.